happy Tuesday. My guest this week is classical and jazz virtuoso, my very good friend Rex Richardson. Hi, Rex. Good to see you.
Hey Mark, thanks man.
Hey,
Great to be with you.
absolutely. And before we go much further, I want to say these Zoom chats are sponsored by Studio259Productions.com. And Rex is in one of these books playing a couple of etudes that nobody else wanted to touch.
I was the only one dumb enough to mess with those maybe. Yeah.
and oh, it came off very well. I thought that sounds impossible. So, oh, well, Rex, I'm so glad you're here. I have obviously a bunch of questions. I'm sure we'll have a couple offshoots here and there. Um, for people that don't aren't as in the trumpet world, Rex, you do a tremendous amount of classical music, new music. You play great jazz. Do a ton of clinics. I wonder if you could kind of just start at the beginning and talk about just why you picked the trumpet, how that even started.
Yeah, that's kind of a funny story because it's not a very inspired or very auspicious beginning, really. I I was always really interested in music since I was a little kid, and believe it or not, when you hear my voice now, of course, it's hard to imagine me as a choral singer, but that's how I started before my voice started getting like this. As a small kid, I was in the church and school choirs, and that was kind of my main musical outlet. And it was really hard to imagine that I was often made the soloist. So I must have not had a voice like this, I'll say, back then. That's nothing on recording, I'm sure. But I was also asthmatic since I was a baby. And at a certain point, when I was about 10, our family doctor told my parents, you should probably start a wind instrument. My best buddy at the time played the trumpet. So I said, hey, why don't I try the trumpet? You know what I mean? And that was really the reason why I initially picked up the trumpet. Not a very
Yeah.
inspired beginning.
Well, my grandmother convinced me to do it and save me from the saxophone. So, that was I'm grateful for that. So that could have been a really short road. So
I love saxophonists. I'm just saying, at least the end. But we have to make the jokes, don't we? We have to. Come
if
on.
we don't make the jokes, yeah,
Someone else will.
someone else will. So you started playing. You were 10, but then your first serious study was just a couple years after that, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I didn't realize this at the time, but I think it sort of overlapped with when my voice started getting really messed up. I was sort of asked to leave. We lived in Hawaii at the time. My dad was in the Coast Guard, and we lived all over the place, man. Like, I was born in California. We lived in Alaska when I was a toddler. Then I think, back to California, then Hawaii, then New York City, back to Hawaii, then Boston, and then from there, oh man, maybe it was back. I'm getting a little confused as to some of the timeline. Oh no, the second after the Hawaii was after, second time was after Boston. Then we ended up in the D.C. area, which is really where my folks settled. But I was asked to. I was 12, I think, when I was in Honolulu Children's Choir. I was asked to leave the group when I could no longer sing the second alto parts, which were the the lowest parts in the group. And this woman, our director, she was very intimidating. She had great ears, and she could hear me hosing those parts, man, all the way from the back row. And she called me down and started having me sing some notes at the piano, and she kept going lower and lower. And she's like, yeah, you're a baritone. Something's wrong with you. You're not supposed to be a baritone when you're 12. And not a good baritone, might I add. So that was kind of the beginning of a very quick ending to my vocal career. And I think shortly thereafter, I started to get more into the trumpet because maybe it started to seem to me more like it might be a real outlet. And so I think I remember being in Hawaii and listening to, pulling out records from my mom and dad's record collection, and they had Herb Alpert and Tijuana Brass, and they had these big band collections, where I'd hear Bunny Berrigan and Harry James and Doc, and I started to get kind of fascinated, And one thing that really struck me was watching TV back there, and they would do the Boston Pops broadcasts, and I would see Andre Combe and Tim Morrison, very young Tim Morrison at the time, because this would have been, I don't know, maybe 82 or something, playing in the section, and they had sea trumpets, and that messed with my head, because I'm like, why don't they look like mine? What's wrong with my trumpet? But that just kind of stoked more curiosity, and I started saving up my money to buy records, and somehow the bug bit me. Between the ages of about 13 and 14, I started to get very serious, and when we moved to the D.C. area, I started studying with Denny Edelbrock.
Right.
Of course, a lot of people know him as the founder of the National Trumpet Competition, and he played in the Army Brass Quintet for a long time. And he was a wonderful teacher for me. I don't think I would have figured out how to play if it weren't for Denny, because I had a couple of very basic problems that he fixed. But I was crazy about it. I was practicing about 4 hours a day from the time I was a freshman in high school. And Denny helped to sort of channel that energy the right direction. And then I started to get better, started to figure it out.
So 4 hours a day when you were a freshman in high school, and that's when you started with Denny, right? Was it in freshman in high school? So what was that breakdown like? I mean, first of all, it's a tremendous amount of dedication for a freshman in high school. I mean, I think anybody would say that. Were you playing before school? Were you playing during school? Was it all after?
Yeah, I think it was kind of all the time. I would try to get some in before school, and then on breaks, I'd be hanging out in the band room. I'd be practicing after school, and eventually the actual practice time started to lower a bit because I became more and more involved in community groups. I was playing in, there was a group called the Northern Virginia Youth Symphony, which now has a much grander name of the American Youth Philharmonic, so they've upgraded their their status. But that was like every Monday night I was playing with them, and then I played with a group called the Brass of Peace, which was a brass ensemble based at Peace Lutheran Church in just outside of D.C. And this was led by Colonel Gil Mitchell, who was a retired Army band conductor and a wonderful man. He used to scare me so much, but it was all with love. I mean, I played better for him out of fear, I think. A little bit like John Painter at Northwestern.
And a lot of people have gone through that group. I mean,
Yes, a lot of people you might know, people like Jeff Work, who's been playing in the Oregon Symphony for a long time. He used to be a freelancer all over Boston area and wonderful player. I'm forgetting the name of the young woman who plays principal horn in the Philadelphia Orchestra.
Jen Montone?
Yes, Jen. Jen is an alum of the group. Scott Weiss, who now is director of bands at University of South Carolina, and he was a killing trumpet player in high school.
Yeah.
If you ever see Scott, you can say to him, well, I should tell you what he says to me off every now and then. He's like, "Hey man, remember that time you beat me in that audition in high school?" "Oh right, that never happened." He was a year ahead of me, but he was so killing, and his IQ, I guess, was too high to just stick with the trumpet. He got into the conducting world, and he's just set it on fire. Wonderful guy, and I've had the great opportunity to collaborate with him a few times since then, so that's been really great. But yeah, a lot of really nice musicians came through that group, and it was an incredible experience. So between that and the various ensembles I was dealing with and trying to play some jazz bands, in some ways my actual private practice time went down a bit, but my overall playing time kept going up overall. Yeah.
So what did Denny have you working on? Or did you have a routine, or was it, how structured were those 4 hours?
I don't remember some of the details. I can tell you there are two things I was working on very assiduously, you could say, back at that point. One was kind of releasing the death grip I had on the trumpet when I played. I loved the right and left arm breath support approach, and so I would spend time doing that old school thing with putting your trumpet on the Arbenz book and sitting over your bed and hoping the trumpet didn't crash to the floor and it wasn't destroyed. And I also spent a lot of time training flexibility. And initially, I didn't have the chops to do all this practice, So Danny was telling me to practice less. It's like, stop, put the trumpet down before you permanently destroy your embouchure, But eventually, I found a groove. I mean, I was working on repertoire. I was working on transposition, even from that early period. I got a lesson here and there with a guy named Bill Siegfried, who was a really great jazz player and recent grad at the time from Indiana University, and also another alum of the Brass of Peace. And so yeah, there was all kinds of stuff I was trying to work on. I would often it wasn't always structured practice. I would listen to my Winton and Rafael Mendez records and Woody Shaw and Freddie Hubbard and all these cats and try to play like them, which I failed miserably at it. But I kept trying, and it did probably boost my progress to even try that,
Well, it raises your expectations, right? I mean, if you're listening to people like that, that's what you automatically aspire to it. So, and was he having you work on Clark and Arbin at this point too? Danny was, and I mean, I'm sure you got Clark and Arbin going pretty good at an early age. Well, but what about your upper register though? Did you have a great upper register? Did that come to you fairly easy?
Yeah, well, the upper register was kind of funny because I remember I had braces on when I was a kid, and I had the misfortune to get them off one day in 7th grade on the day of a school audition, not knowing enough to realize what a catastrophe this was be, and of course it was, and I'm like, I can't play. That audition did not go well. But what struck me was in a couple of weeks, my range shot up an octave, and I was playing in the G above high C range or so when I was 13, and unfortunately, a lot of it was driven by the 2-arm breath support. And so
Yeah.
I remember playing that note for Denny early on, my first meeting, and he was like, "Yeah, don't ever do that again." And I didn't realize how horrible it sounded and he realized how I was doing everything incorrectly. So my range initially plummeted once I was no longer using muscle to play, but I built it back up from flexibility, and so that again seemed to be almost not instantaneous. But I can tell you, the transformation, the way this routine worked for Denny was remarkable, because I do remember a couple of things. I remember not, as a freshman in high school, not being able to slur from a C to an E in the staff,
Right.
at least not without using these muscles, and can imagine what that sounded. And a year later, I could do a lip trill on F above high C. So, and that was all through this basic flexibility routine that Denny had me doing, and
Is that something he
learning to
had
be.
written out, or was it something from other books?
It was just this ba da 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 dee da dee da 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 dee da dee, that thing that
Yeah.
I kind of teach people all the time, and I made a couple of those videos about, and it's so basic. What's great about it is that because it's rhythmically symmetrical and it's very simple, you can put it on the metronome. So your first goal is to just make it fluid and consistent, and when that's working, you start aiming for speed and you start adding range, and you can be very incremental in your progress because of the way it's structured. So for example, excuse me, if I start on G in the staff and I want to do the next partial starting on C, and it's like, it's a little too high, it's not really comfortable, well, I can go to 4th position. So maybe I'm going to use 1 and 2. It's like, oh, okay, that works okay. And gradually increase, go up by half steps until it's working, and then do the same thing. So you can very gradually, by half steps, increase your range and increase your speed. And so, yeah, by the time I was a senior in high school, I could do those exercises faster than I can now. I don't know I'm not sure how to feel about that, really. But it was all metronome training, and it was whatever sort of structured discipline I learned from Denny. If I didn't have that, I wouldn't have figured it out,
And that's what you do with students now, right? While we're talking about flexibility, I mean, are there any books that you find with flexibility, or is this a lot of stuff like that kind of basic thing that you
Well,
outlined?
I always encourage students to check out the various books that have a lot of the flexibility exercises. Obviously, there's some in Arbin's. There's the Colon, which was a great book. for me early on. So I used to mess around with all these exercises, colon, irons.
Mm-hmm.
I discovered a little bit after high school. Some of the stuff in the Schlossberg. So all this stuff can be very useful. My new favorite book is Scott Belk's books for flexibility, particularly because they dress flexibility a little more, mirroring the circumstances in which we encounter those challenges in repertoire.
Yeah.
Because the exercises I'm doing are very much in the abstract, and they're very helpful, but sometimes they'd be like, wow, this works fine as a lip slur exercise, but in this lick, it's not working. And that's what I love about Scott's books, is that they're so great about that, and they're hilarious, of course, like Scott is.
And,
So
yeah. And they can bring you into a deep depression for a little bit while you're realizing
when you first encounter each exercise, sort of like the Charlier book, right? Charlier was a genius at making us feel like we were idiots at the trumpet, but every etude made you that much better at the trumpet, and it added up to a lot by the time you finish with that book.
And now you watch Håkan play them, I think, oh, I really missed that, didn't I?
That's a good reaction to hearing Håkan playing those. Yeah, definitely. One of my biggest heroes from the time his first recording came out, which was in 1984, I believe. 1984, his first recording came out. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so that's what you were doing in high school. You had great range. Danny had taught you flexibility. Now, what kind of solos were you playing back then?
I started off, I think my very first solo in high school as a freshman was the Tomei Fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Danny chose it for me because it has some nice technical challenges, but while I was getting rid of the death grip, he didn't want me dealing with the high register, and it only goes to like an A, I think. And, And at the time, I don't think Reinhold Friedrich's recording existed. I'm not sure. I didn't find it much later, but I love that recording. And so I didn't have, and of course back then it wasn't as easy to find recordings, so I was shooting a little bit blindly there. But I started with that, and I kind of went through a lot of the major repertoire. By the time I graduated, I'd played Hummel, Haydn, Neruda, Tartini. I did for solo ensemble at one point, Tomasi, Brandenburg.
You're playing Brandenburg in high school.
Yes.
Was your band director happy about this?
I didn't do it in band, and I
I mean, not the Brandenburg, of course, but I mean, just in general, that you were able to do this stuff in his band. Amazing.
I had 3 band directors actually in my high school career, just by weird circumstance. So one of them was a guy named Mo Turrentine, who was he went on to become supervisor of the county. He was a great guy. And then Chris Zara, who has become a bigwig in music education circles now. He's a professor at Eastman of music ed, and he was this great jazz piano player, man. And so I was so sad at jazz my first couple of years of high school. I was so bad the first time I played in a big band, I didn't understand swing to the degree that I couldn't come in after any rest in the right place. I was total rhythmic confusion, man. It's hilarious to look back on that. But so Chris used to play and mesmerize us, and then Gary Markham, who became superintendent down in Cobb County, Georgia, was my band director for my last 2 years, and he's very involved in like the Music for All, and you see him at the Midwest Clinic, and a wonderful guy. It's nice it's been great to stay in touch with him. But man, those guys are great. They were all so supportive, and sometimes I played well, sometimes I didn't, but they knew I was always really trying, and they were really supportive, as I was dealing with regionals and all states and all that kind of stuff. And but yeah, it was great. It was a nice band program at Robinson High School in Fairfax that I went to, because those guys set it up, and it was just a nice group of students to work with. So yeah, I was very lucky. Lucky.
So then after high school, you go to Chicago.
Yeah.
And there's a whole big chapter right there for you.
Yeah, it's a bit of an odd chapter. I went to Northwestern, but I ended up getting an anthropology degree. I think you
Yeah.
probably know. And so I the best thing about Northwestern, of course, me was my lessons with Vince. I just at the time we weren't getting that many lessons with him just because of his schedule. I think he might have been a little bit tired at the time, and the team teaching that was happening, some of the other folks I was working with, I wasn't as happy with. So what I wanted to do, if I could, was sort of continue to study with him outside of the music school, but that just didn't really work out, I think, because of his schedule. So I was just kind of on my own
Yeah.
in terms of lessons.
Did
I
you
might
guys stay
grab,
in touch? Did you guys stay in touch over the years, or not as much?
not really. I think it gradually just kind of faded, not through any deliberate thing. It
Of
was
course.
just,
Yeah.
eventually he retired, of course, and I ended up, after a few years, moving to New York and then to Louisiana. It's kind of all over the place till I ended up in Richmond back in
Yeah.
2002.
Yeah. Well, but you left the music school to study anthropology, and not Charlie Parker anthropology, actual anthropology, or Dizzy Gillespie anthropology, I should say. That's what you
Yeah,
mentioned, right?
I'm not sure. I thought it was Bird, but a lot of the attributions for these tunes are really confusing. I was just, I was, this comes up all the time. I was doing a lesson yesterday with this kid who's walking the Days of Wine and Roses, and we were checking out Clark Terry playing it, and he quotes Walking at the end. I'm like, man, you know that tune Walking? The kid's like, no. I'm like, let's check it out. And then we start seeing all that comes up, all the different attributions for who wrote whatever various iterations of the tune. So maybe it's the same with anthropology. I'm not sure who's the true author of that, but yeah, in my case, it was the academic
Actual.
discipline with
Yeah.
a bit of an emphasis, I guess, on archaeology. But
Hmm.
I'm not entirely sure in retrospect why I chose anthropology. I have some theories um, I I could earn the liberal arts degree in something that I found fascinating without really taking me away from the trumpet. Because a lot of the time I should have been in the library. I was in a practice room with the trumpet, and I was going to jam sessions, and I was a terrible jazz player at this point as a freshman in college. As you can imagine, from the repertoire I took out, my technique was developed, but there was no musical understanding to govern it.
Yeah.
So
Right.
man, talk about strong and wrong when it came to jazz improv. I mean, it was loud, fast, wrong key, bad time, any other horrible thing you can imagine. That's what I was doing as an 18-year-old, and but I learned from people like Brad Good was in Chicago at the time, and I would hang out with Brad, and I got a couple lessons. And Brad was such a great bass player that I would sometimes get these silly little cocktail gigs, and I would hire Brad to play bass and give him all the money because I knew he'd be coaching me as he's playing. That would be kind of like a lesson for me. And so I started getting, called to play in some big band sections, and I was just shedding and shedding. And
What kind of
I
things was
got on.
Brad telling you at this time? I mean, what kind of describe, like, you know, what were you doing that was off? Where was the transition? Like, what kind of things did you do to fix things?
Well, what was necessary for me to do, I had to deal with more of a working understanding of harmony. And it's a weird thing because I've always really kind of been a theory geek since I was in high school. I was really into theory, I took AP theory, but it was a bit of an abstract thing in a way that it's not supposed to be for a jazz player. So this idea of the theory's got to be kind of under your fingers, the understanding, always understanding what key you're in, whether you choose to play in it or not. You've got some options there, but you have to know what key you're supposed to be in.
Right.
You have to understand if you're, there's sort of a modern take on how jazz is organized that, codified by this guy back here, Mark Levine. If you can see that book,
Mm-hmm.
the Jazz Theory book's a great reference book. And this idea that you can look at a set of chord changes and designate a mode or possible choice of modes for any one of those chords based on on the key you're in, it gives you a harmonic context. It doesn't limit you in terms of what you will play, but it gives you a context. Those are things that I just wasn't doing. And I wasn't, I learned a lot about Brad's ideas about what real improvisation was as opposed to just sort of lick-based playing as well. And, but yeah, it took a certain point. It wasn't real until I was 22 when I was out of school and already pretty much a full-time musician in Chicago doing studio work and doing all kinds of gigging that I really immersed myself in jazz and started to solve those problems in a way that I hadn't really dealt with before, you know.
Yeah. And you were in Chicago Civic Orchestra too, right around this time?
Yeah, that was early. That was it was funny. I think it was right as I dropped out of the music school.
Yeah.
It was like I decided the way I'm going to play this because I knew how they were at Northwestern. Was like, if you're not in the music school, you don't get to play in the pool. You don't get to play the top, 10 players. So I took the audition, got in the orchestra, took the Civic Orchestra audition, and there's sort of a pool of us there too.
Right.
Where it was similar, where there may be 10 people who are on the list who might rotate in and out. There was like kind of a core. And so I got to play a few concerts with him that year. As part of that, I also got coached by Bud a couple of times. That was, something I'll never forget, of course. But yeah, so that was important. I also got to play in a really great brass quintet that I joined when I was a freshman, and we continued to play even when I was out of the music school. We were involved with this Civic Chamber Music Series and some other things that were really good for me in my, continued learning.
Yeah, who was in that quintet? Anybody?
Well, it's funny. There's a guy you've probably not heard of, David Etterbeek, I'm assuming, trumpet player, right? Dave is one of those mysterious cases. He was a really good friend of mine. He just sort of fell away from playing. But to give you an idea of the kind of player he was, do you remember the 17 magazine competition? You're younger than I am, but
Ryan won that, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Second prize was David Etterbeek. And Jim Stevenson and Paul McKello were the other cats in that final group of people.
Now was Paul on the cover? Was he on the cover?
I hope he's watching this.
I hope so.
He'll appreciate that. Paul should have been the face of 17 magazine. Come on, man, Paul's another great friend.
Yeah.
But so that's the kind of player Dave was, when he came as a freshman. In fact, Dave, I think that year when I got to play with Civic, he actually was principal in Civic as a 19-year-old. So he was quite prodigious. So playing in a quintet with him was fantastic. And a guy named Steve Plogel, who's a horn player, who I think is also not in the business anymore, but he played with the Detroit Symphony for a while. Tim Weiss, who I think has been teaching at Oberlin for a really long time. I think he got that gig right out of undergrad as director of bands or something kind of absurd. He was a really talented bass trombonist. And then Brian Deal, who is a really wonderful.
Brian.
Yeah, you know Brian.
Yeah,
Brian was
really well. We
playing
played a quintet
trombone
together.
Oh, okay, great, man. Great player, man. Just like what finesse and what beautiful musicianship that guy had. So that was the group, and it was such a great learning experience for me. Coached by Rex Martin, who's been in Switzerland recently. I finally got to see him after all these years, just last year when I was working with Giolano Sommerhalder students, because Giolano just started teaching there, and got to see Rex, so that was a flashback to the Northwestern days. But
wow, good group though.
Yeah,
it
was something, man. It was really something special.
But after that, you kind of transitioned more into just playing jazz for a little while. That's right.
For a minute, yeah. So it was like that period when I was 22 where I kind of just set classical music on the side. I wasn't working on the repertoire. I mean, I'd still play whatever gigs I was called for, and I kept my fundamentals together, but I was really immersed in jazz in a way that I hadn't properly, and I recorded my first CD not even a year after that process started. So in retrospect, I shake my head because I didn't really know what I was doing, you know what I mean? But I felt like I had to do it, and I still still like the tunes and the arrangements, but sometimes the trumpet playing is like, ooh. And then when I was 25, so like 3 years into this process, I've been really kind of, focused on this jazz track, leading a quintet, playing a bunch of bands, doing studio work, whatever I can, and feel like okay, I'm a jazz player now, and
Yeah.
this is kind of what I do. But then I got a call from Rhythm and Brass, and they were looking for someone who was a classical player who could play jazz. And I was like, man, is that still me? I don't know, maybe I'm just a jazz player. But when I listened to the recordings, I got really excited. They just had a couple CDs out at the time, and I liked the sort of the jazz-ish stuff they were doing, and some of the straight jazz stuff they were doing, and the classical stuff knocked me out, man. Some of what they were doing reminded me of Empire Brass. I mean, Whiff Rudd playing with that fat sign, Charles Villarubia playing too, but these guys were just so killing. I was like, man, I want to try for this. So I was scrambling to get my classical chops back together. And I got lessons from Kevin Hartman, who's in Milwaukee now, and Neil Bernstein. I knew both of those guys. They were in Evanston at the time, and Neil's been in Pittsburgh Symphony, and those guys have helped me get back into classical shape. And the funny thing is I pulled the repertoire out that I used to play.
Yeah.
That hard stuff, that at the time I hadn't been dealing with Tomasi Brandenburg. I pull them out, and I'm like, I don't know, but I showed up, and I remember one of the first things I did because I showed up to, I think it was Pittsburgh, Kansas, where our good friend Todd is now, and they had a concert there, and they flew me out to hang out with them, and I spent a few hours playing with them, and in fact, they started off, they're like, do you want to play for us, or do you want to play with us? And I was like, I would like to play with you. And thankfully, Whiff was so killing. It was so easy to lock in with him and match what he was doing. And all those guys were playing at such a high level. I was pretty intimidated, but also thrilled to be kind of, hanging with him. It must have been like 3 hours we played together. Then they're like, okay, cool, we got to chill because we got a concert tonight, but why don't you jump in on the last tune? They had this arrangement of Caravan. Mm-hmm. They wanted me to jump in at the end and play a solo. And so all that went pretty well. I felt like a good vibe with them, and then they invited me to come out to. They had a concert near Chicago the following week, Portage, Indiana, and they said, "Why don't you come play a whole concert as part of the finals?" And I remember at the time too, I was just getting sick. My asthma was a problem at the time, and I would often get pneumonia, and I was having a bit of a rough time, and I wanted to hide it from him because I didn't want them to think I was sickly or something.
Right.
So what happened was, I'm at home, I'm kind of chilling, recovering, and then I got a call from them. It was that Sunday. It was just like a few days after I got back, a few days before I would have gone to Indiana, and they're like, hey man, we're at O'Hare, and Bob Thompson, who's the guy who's going to leave the group, he's sick. He can't come to Iowa to play the concert. Can you come play the concert? Because of the people they were auditioning, I was in the closest city. So I said, yeah, sure. I mean, I wanted a gig, so they flew me out that night, and it was scary. It's like I think I landed maybe at 6:30 p.m. and at 7:30 I was on stage. They threw a coat on me. I had to sight read 2/3 of the rep on stage, and back then I could kind of do that because I was a freelance trumpet player in the city. We're reading all the time. Now I'd be dead in the water. Everything I play is either from memory or practice for 6 months at least. So I
you'd
don't.
be all right, I bet.
Oh man, no, it'd be much tougher. But it worked out. And then there were snowstorms keeping Bob joining them from the tour on the tour from Chicago. So they're like, would you stay out and play a couple more concerts? So I did. I canceled myself in Chicago. Went home. A day later, I was supposed to come out and play the thing in Portage. And when I showed up, they were like, you got the gig. They didn't let me play or worry about me playing the concert because they'd seen me under tough circumstances and saw that we worked well together, and that was that. And so from that point on, it's a long way of answering your
No.
your
That was
question
what we're looking
obliquely.
for. Yeah. Yeah.
I returned to classical music really because of rhythm and brass,
Yeah.
and it was because of them that I started playing both classical music and jazz in the same concerts. You know.
Yeah. Well, it's always, a couple of times I've heard you guys together. You and Whiff blend so well together.
Oh, thanks, man.
Yeah.
That's a compliment to me for sure.
Well, I mean, and and Whiff is like the nicest guy in the world. So you can be a really nice guy and be around Riff Wed and think you're like a terrible person, right? Like, you know what I mean? He's one of those guys.
Whip is a saint, man. The fact that he
Yeah.
never killed me after like 20 years of touring with me is a testament to his sainthood.
He is.
He,
He is. Yes, he is a saint.
he's one of my favorite human beings on the planet, and that's one reason why he's such an amazing teacher too. You see the books he's put out and the students coming through his program and the way they speak about him. It's all, I'm like, of course, that's just, he's one of those really rare individuals that is so generous and so giving. And I had the privilege of standing next to that guy so many times, and I sometimes just kick myself and I absorbed it. I was smart enough to hear what was happening and absorb it. But it's now I look back, I'm like, man, you are so lucky, dude. I feel really, really fortunate.
Yeah. Well, did you guys talk about playing very much, or was it kind of?
Sometimes there were certain things they did, like one concept I wasn't really aware of. When I started playing with them, I had a weird background, you know what I mean? I hadn't had a real trumpet lesson since I was 19, and I've been focused on jazz for 3 years, and so they were so much, as a group, they were really, really into the concept of centered sound and that centered resonance. And I think at the time, that concept was maybe not as pervasive in brass playing pedagogy.
Yeah.
Back in '95 when I joined the group. So they're often remarking to me and to Tom Brantley, a great trombonist who joined us just a few months after I joined, that we weren't always finding that center and helping us. We've taught me about James Stamp. I didn't really know James Stamp at the time. And so I learned that concept really mostly by modeling and getting advice here and there. Because it'd be the kind of thing, usually something would be frustrating me and I'd go ask Whiff about it. He would never be like, hey man, you sound bad and this is why. When I'd ask him, that's when he'd offer advice, and it was always really insightful. Yeah. Sometimes it was hilarious too. One time I was freaking out about my sound. It was terrible. I was like, my chops are ruined. And he goes, clean your mouthpiece. I'm like, Whiff, don't you understand? This is epic. My life is ruined. I can't play. Listen to this sound. He goes, clean your mouthpiece. I'm like, I went and cleaned my mouthpiece, and everything was fixed. So that was
Maybe that's what I'll do after this is
I still remember that because every now and then I'm still like, what the heck? Oh, Whiff said, clean your mouthpiece. Of course, I'm much better now than I was back then about cleaning it regularly. But if I forget, man, it catches up. It becomes pretty obvious pretty quick. But most of the insights, of course, were much deeper than that, with Whiff, in terms of pedagogy, in terms of breathing, in terms of resonance, phrasing, this sort of amazing projection he always had. And I never felt like I really could match him on some of the stuff we were doing, but it was just striving to do it that was enough to improve what I was doing. And so I was just grateful to have had that opportunity all those years,
Was there anything the quintet did to kind of, as a group, make that resonance happen, or was there repertoire you guys play, like chorale playing or anything like that kind of stuff that you guys did?
Yeah, there were a couple things. I mean, two things come to mind there, and it's all about Johannes Sebastian Bach. Really, we always had a page of chorales out of that big edition of 471 chorales. That a lot of people, the Riemann Schneider, I believe, is the edition, right? That a lot of us have had and analyzed for theory classes.
Right.
So we choose a chorale and we just play it. And so it would always be trombone and tuba in octaves, horn in the next voice, and trumpets in the two voices. And most of the time I would take the second voice, but sometimes we just switch off. And we drilled those a lot. and we were working. We tried different ways of playing short notes so we could hear how bad our pitch was when it just rang without us adjusting and this kind of stuff. And then we always ended up playing one of the contrapuncti, and usually it was the first one. Mm-hmm. We kind of, that almost kind of became a signature piece for us to open our concerts with. And it was amazing how that piece somehow didn't get old. Yeah. There was so much to it, and it was so satisfying to play that we loved playing it. And I think it made a big difference for us, because I think also once we played it for a while and it really started to click for us, people would react to that piece, with all the crazy stuff we do, from Pink Floyd to Beck to all kinds of the Zeppelin, whatever. People will often be like, "Man, that Bach," and we're like, "Man, that's really cool." Yeah. Because so many people play Bach, and if they're hearing something special in what we're doing, then that must mean we're doing something right. So let's keep doing it. Let's keep using that to shape our sound. And so I think that was a real key element for us.
Yeah. There's recordings, and you guys are still playing though, right? When things are not as much, right?
No, I mean, we never disbanded officially, but we played our last concert, I think it'll be 4 years ago in January. Yeah, it was the Oregon Music Educator Association conference. And
that's really only 3 years ago in COVID time, though.
Yeah, really. I mean, I love playing with those guys. I think what was happening too is because people were getting busy with their own projects, and maybe I might have been the busiest, perhaps, in terms of the solo stuff I'm doing, because I started, a lot of years, it was pretty much about 5 months out of the year I was on tour doing solo stuff and jazz stuff. And one of the things that became difficult for me was physically, it was really different to play with that group. So you take a lot of the repertoire I've been doing, something like Stevenson's Extreme Concerto or the recent Vizzuti Three World Winds, those kinds of pieces, or the jazz stuff I do, which require a lot of agility mm-hmm. and a lot of flexibility to my technique. And when I play with rhythm and brass, so much of that was putting out a big wall of sound. And I had trouble balancing both, right? If I was playing my solo stuff, I couldn't really prepare to come out and not get swamped by the group with them. And if I was playing with the group, I was like, okay, I've got it. The sound is happening now. Then I couldn't play the other stuff. So that never really led me to say, hey, I don't want to play anymore. But I think all of us had our reasons where we weren't pushing as much. Yeah. But thankfully, we all left the group with our friendships entirely intact. I mean, it's such a great group of people, and their families are great, and so that's one of the beautiful things. I think some groups don't end up that way. You know what I mean? They play for a long time, and there can be some bad blood here and there, and thankfully we've had none of that. So all those guys remain my dear friends, and always looking for another chance to collaborate in one way or another.
Right. And also during this time, we were talking. You went out and played with Joe Henderson.
Yeah, that started late in '97, and that started because sort of through a weird series of accidents, like many things do. It's like me even getting the rhythm and brass job. That was a weird series of accidents, But with Joe, it started with I was on tour with the Chicago Jazz Ensemble in Italy. We were playing some festivals there, and there was one concert they did called. I don't know, it was a Chicago-focused concert, so they had the Chicago Jazz Ensemble, which was led by Bill Russo at the time, of Stan Kenton fame, and then there was the Art Ensemble of Chicago, which included Lester Bowie, and of course Lester wasn't still in Chicago, but he had this group, and so I got to check them out, which was amazing, and Lester listened to us, and I was, doing some solo stuff with the group, and he was talking to me with me afterwards, and I said, I'm moving to New York, and he was like, he wanted to get my number to see if maybe I might play with the Brass Fantasy. And I was thrilled by that. I said, man, I would love to, of course. But he never called me for that. But I got one voicemail from him saying, you're going to get a call from Joe Henderson's manager about starting to tour I can't remember if it was near the end of '97 or that was just rehearsals, but some stuff was happening in '97. But it's the only time I can remember getting nervous. I got a call that made me nervous about getting a call for a gig. I was like, what? And it worked out. So I had a couple CDs out at the time. I had my first CD, and I had the second one called Pandora's Pocket. And I sent those to Joe's manager after I got the call, and I guess Joe was cool with them, and in a way it probably helped that people like Lee Morgan and Freddie and Woody, these were kind of like my heroes, and these guys that had played with him, in his prime. So I started playing with him, and the first gig was like kind of a test. It was like a week at the Iridium in New York, and then a week at the Jazz Bakery in Hollywood, kind of back to back. That was a funny sociological experiment for me too, to be in Manhattan for a week, which is, I lived in Brooklyn at the time, but then to be in Hollywood right after that, compare
totally different
the people, the culture, the weather, and I got yelled at for jaywalking in Hollywood, which is really confusing to a New Yorker, of course. But and then that was sort of the test, and I guess I passed, and then I did a tour with Joe in Japan, and just a number of other concerts. We played festivals in Canada, Edmonton, Montreal, Calgary, and a few other things. And the last thing we did was the Stern Grove Festival in San Francisco, which was, where Joe was living at the time. And apparently right after we finished, he went right into the hospital. This would have been in mid to late August, I think. And that was it. Joe never toured again.
Yeah.
And so it was an amazing episode, but it was very short-lived, unfortunately, due to Joe's declining health. Yeah.
So did you and Joe have conversations about things, or was he kind of to himself, or how was that?
He was very much to himself. He was nice. He was not throwing out a bad vibe, but he was very, very quiet, and it was really intimidating because he's freaking Joe Henderson, you know what I mean? And he still sounded the same as he always did. So,
yeah.
And Joe, because he didn't feel good, we'd play the head of a tune, and he'd stand up and play the first solo, because then he could sit down the longest while everyone blew. And so sometimes I had to follow Joe. And I was like, no, And then Conrad Herwig was playing trombone. So I'm like, great. You got a Hercules on the trombone, you got Einstein on the tenor, and where's this fool going to kind of fit into that thing? And at first it was really scary and freaky, man. And but I kind of found my niche, and it started to feel more comfortable. And
did you feel like your jazz playing developed more while you were on that tour? Did Joe ever say anything, or?
He didn't say anything about me developing. I think the way it wasn't one straight tour. It was basically, every month there were a handful of concerts, until August. And so, yeah. But I was shedding a lot. And when I realized, I was going to be on the hit, I already knew a lot of Joe's music and almost all of his recordings, but I got anything I was missing and got, the transcription of all his solos and all his tunes, and I was just completely immersed in it, But with Joe, it was funny because you didn't get a lot of feedback. Every now and then, after a solo, I would get a, "Yeah, Rex," from Joe. And man, I'd be on cloud nine,
right?
And I couldn't predict, because I never really felt like I played well on any of the solos, so I couldn't find a pattern in terms of what made him say that. But maybe he's in a good mood, I don't know. But it was always a big boost to get any kind of a comment like that from Joe,
Did he ever bring up, Lee Morgan or Freddie or Woody or any of those guys?
No. He rarely talked to us, and he never really hung out with the band.
Yeah.
The longest conversation I probably ever had with him was at the end of the first week in the Iridium gig, when each one of us went up individually to his room, his hotel room, to get the checks. Mm-hmm. and we talked for a while, and he was watching, like, I remember his details. It was like CNN was on. There was something happening with the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. He was watching. And he was just talking about current events a bit, very calm, and that was about it. That was it, man. And so, he'd greet you and all that, but he's very quiet. And so some of the other guys in the group, like Conrad and Stefan Harris, who was playing vibes, and George Mraz was playing bass. We had a handful of different drummers who came through. I got, fairly close with them at the time, and probably in particular Conrad, I would say,
Yeah.
he was really acting as a mentor to me in a way that Joe wasn't actively doing. I mean, just hearing Joe play was like a huge education, but Conrad would actually offer feedback, always kindly, never like,
Yeah.
unkind or anything, but I would often ask for his feedback and ask what he thought, and he helped a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So you were just to be clear, you were Joe Henderson's last trumpet player.
Apparently,
Right?
yeah, because that was there were two kind of iterations. It was mostly a sextet, when it would be the three horns and vibes, bass and drums. And then in Japan, there was no chordal instrument, if you can imagine that. It was a quintet with three horns, bass, and drums. So that was intimidating. We played blue notes in a couple of the cities at the time, Fukuoka and Osaka for that tour. But yeah, so it was, I don't think, yeah, I guess so. And literally because I played his last concert with him, and then he didn't tour after that, very sadly. So.
Wow. Yeah. So then when does LSU come into the picture?
Almost immediately after that. So this was a weird timing where a month before Joe got sick, I had met a young lady on tour that I kind of fell head over heels for, and she was a student at LSU. And so I was already starting kind of a long distance relationship, I guess. It was in the very beginnings. I mean, at that point. But I started to realize within a couple months that Joe was probably going to be done. And he didn't actually pass away until a while after that. I want to say maybe a year and a half or something. But the word from his agency was that he's the touring, because we were going to go to Europe in October, and that would have been my first time to play in Europe with Joe, and all the stuff got canceled. And I felt kind of disenchanted about New York in a way, because I was just kind of exhausted at the time. I was traveling a lot. It was either out with Joe or Rhythm and Brass. And I wasn't really at home and kind of becoming part of the community. Most people go to New York, become part of the community, and then they start doing touring projects like this. And I showed up just through incredible luck. The reason why I got to play with Joe is because someone, I won't say who it was, but he's someone I admire very much, and he's a friend, and he's an amazing trumpet player. He got asked to play, and he had asked for more money, and apparently that didn't go over well with the manager, and that's when Joe asked Lester Bowie for a recommendation. So, and it went forever great. Like I said, a series of happy accidents,
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
so I didn't really feel connected to the community, even though I'd been there for, at the time, maybe a couple years. And I kind of felt like this touring stuff is great, but it's a hard life. And I started thinking maybe I should try to teach. And so I decided, well, what's going on at LSU? And it turns out they had a jazz assistantship available, and I could start a master's in trumpet. So I knew Jim West, who was a trumpet prof at the time. I had known him from Tanglewood from years when I was in high school. And so they're like, yeah, man, we can give you the assistantship, and you can start the master's degree. So that lucked out with the timing. And then when I was there, they're like, we can triple your assistantship if you start a doctorate. I was like, a doctorate? Why would I even think about starting a doctorate, And but I said, did you say triple my assistantship? Because touring, playing, and that stuff was kind of my only income at the time. I also started teaching adjunct at a couple schools in New Orleans and started to get to play down there, like at Snug Harbor and some of those other clubs. And subbing, I think I won. There was an opening in the Baton Rouge Symphony, so I just for that won that chair, but I had to give it up because I couldn't make whatever the required percentage of gigs were. Yeah, so I became a sub, or I had to be denigrated to, I don't know, the third trumpet or something, which is fine. I mean, I got to play some orchestral playing, and that was fun. But then I decided, so I started the doctorate, and then I decided, man, I think I'm going to try to finish this thing. And I did, but it was grueling because the whole episode was 2.5 years.
Yeah.
I started the master's in the fall of '99, and I finished, I was ABD with all the recitals and all the courses in December of 2001. And then in 2006, once I was already teaching at VCU, that semester I did my final project and did a lecture recital to finish the doctorate.
What was the lecture recital?
It was a comparative analysis of Freddie Hubbard and Woody Shaw on their Blue Note recordings they did together. I took 9 of the tunes, analyzed the solos, did a sort of a, what was it? I think it was called Structural Elegance and Harmonic Disparity. I'm not even sure I still have that right, even though I wrote it. But it was basically looking at how they could use all this kind of crazy chromaticism and yet make it something that looked berserk on the page if you're analyzing it, and make it sound so killing. And that was basically the project. Yeah.
So when you're looking at those two players, what if you were to take stuff from Freddie and stuff from Woody, what were you trying to take from each one? Was there a specific like dialect? Was it like the chordal harmony and quintal harmony like Woody would play, or was there something that Freddie was doing that you found drawn to?
Yeah, I was drawn to both of them for sure. With Freddie, I mean, Woody was an incredible trumpet player, but Freddie, I think Freddie is really, if you have to make a top small handful of the greatest virtuosos ever to play the trumpet, Freddie would be in there, regardless of genre. And you look at who are the greatest people to ever play the trumpet in terms of overall command of the horn and jazz? It'd be probably Freddie, Clifford Brown, and Lewis. I mean, those, maybe Winton kind of in it too. I mean, it's a very, very elite group. And so it was just the not only the virtuosity, but the elegance of his playing, the beauty of his articulation, the beauty of his sound. Once I found out he'd gotten a French horn scholarship to study at DePaul, I realized, maybe that has something to do with that sound, that really unusual sound that he developed on the instrument. And now I think by the 80s, he was maybe not quite as disciplined as he was in the 60s. All those recordings he did in the 60s of both under his own name as a sideman, just extraordinary, playing the discipline of the improvisation as well as the virtuosity, But Freddie, he continued to explore harmonically, and what struck me about studying those recordings is I got the sense that he would hear Woody do something, and he'd be like, I can do that too. And there was this real competitive edge between the two of them, and Woody was very methodical, and you could see real kind of a structured approach to how he was dealing with things. Like I found this particular kind of hexatonic scale he would use all the time. And Freddie tended to be much more kind of free with it. And Freddie did something I thought was really interesting. He would do kind of a diatonic reharmonization. So, for example, he'd be playing over the bridge of like Night in Tunisia. In this case, I think it was Lotus Blossom. You got 2-5-1 A minor, and so you got that B half diminished chord to start with, and you can think of that as if you're thinking modally, Locrian maybe as your mode, and he come in, he was playing an F major triad, so all those notes fit the Locrian mode, but F major to B minor and all this. I mean, it somehow he would make it work, and he would do that kind of stuff that I didn't really hear Woody Shaw doing. Woody was much more about using direct chromatic contrast, I think, to create the tension. But what really struck me about both those guys is that, when it comes to tonal music, what's the most important thing? There's tension and there's release. We think of a 5/1 chord. Those guys always honored that.
Yeah.
They were amazing about that. They never sort of left stuff hanging where it's like, oh, the dissonance never really went away. No matter how out they went, it always sort of dissipated. And that's one thing that created, I think, that beautiful sense of narrative and sense of flow that both of them had to their solos.
That's the first time I've heard somebody say hexatonic on one of these interviews, and chordal harmonies come up, and yeah, that's the deepest it's gotten.
We better start talking about mouthpieces soon, man. Come on.
Oh man, don't worry. There'll be something about throats and backdoors that coming before you know it. So
if only I knew anything about that.
I don't know if it sounds good or not. So
right.
So now what did you? So you're working with James West, who you've known a long time. What kind of things did you glean from him? Was it about running a studio? Was it some of those kind of ideas?
Yeah, Jim was so great to work with because at the time it could have been an awkward thing because I was an older grad student. I was, I guess, 29, 30 around then when I came in. And I was maybe as busy as a performer probably as any of the faculty. Mm-hmm. But Jim, there was no weird competitive vibe or anything. He didn't try to put me in my place. He was very, we'd play in a quintet together, so I got to play in the faculty quintet. And he was like, well, this looks hard. Why don't you play this? any of the really challenging stuff, he would just get me to play. And he was just like that. He was very gracious, and he was just a beautiful player, so consistent and so just kind of thoughtful in his approach. But he also recognized that I probably didn't need that much help with playing the instrument. What my problem is, I had no idea what I was doing when I played the instrument. So at the time, I looked at a kid who couldn't do what I was doing. I was like, I don't know why you can't do this. So Jim was all about helping me with pedagogy. So between the books and the approach he took, he really helped me to at least lay the foundation. Unfortunately, I think I still have a few blind spots in my teaching for the mechanics of the trumpet that I don't really know or understand cerebrally. That's because maybe it's not something I've particularly thought about in my own playing, so I haven't approached it that way. But I'm better than I used to be, and I also have allies. I have colleagues that I keep close by who are experts in these areas that can help me, whether it's students in our studio that might need a little bit of attention with this, or just people I meet while traveling. I was like, I got the guy, and I'll give one of them a shout out. Both of them. Taylor Barnett is one of my colleagues at VCU. So when I met him, was a wonderful jazz player. Didn't have the best chops, but he figured it out, and he's got wonderful chops now. Did a doctorate in classical music, as well as being a first prize winner in NTC in the jazz division. He's a really serious player. And then Kevin Maloney, a lot of people I know from Pershing's Own, who's a wonderful teacher. Both those guys are really great with fundamentals and with mechanics of playing. So if I have questions, I never let it go to the point that a kid is going to be left out in the cold. I make sure we call our experts to get it sorted out.
Well, that's the next thing I was going to ask you. So is that when you went to VCU after this, right?
Yeah, I first, let's see, through more luck, I was able to be a visiting professor at Ithaca College. Starting in January of 2002. And it was just a one semester thing. And that was my first taste of full-time teaching. And while I was there, what's that?
And you stuck with it.
And somehow I stuck with it, right. Well, that was the honeymoon period, right? There were no
That's right.
committees. Everyone was nice to me because they knew I was gone. And a few months if they hated me, it wasn't worth it. So, and it was a blast. And I was working for Frank Campos, who was writing one of his books, and he and Kim had a great group of kids there. So working with them and playing with that faculty quintet was a lot of fun. So yeah, it was a really fun, nice gig. And then when I was there, I interviewed for the VCU job, and that worked out, and I started there the following fall of 2002.
Yeah. So you've been there since 2002. So that's 18 years now. How do you think your playing is? I mean, not your playing. Your teaching has changed in that time period.
Well, I think that I do know more about the mechanics than I used to. I'm not quite as blind about how to play the trumpet as I was when I came in. But I think also there are always little details that change because I'm always trying to expose myself to new information. So, for example, this is a book here that was pretty. It's been pretty famous for the last 9 years or so since it came out, and I just discovered this like maybe 2 years ago, and it's had a big influence on me. There's a book called Peak by Anders Ericsson, who's quoted in the Talent Code, subtitled "The Secrets of the New Science from the New Science of Expertise." Malcolm Gladwell's books. This kind of learning has had a big influence on how I teach, and often we will explore one of these books in the studio class. For example, we're doing that right now with the Talent Code. So we're making these poor kids read this book and asking them how it can apply, how these lessons can apply to their trumpet teaching, the trumpet playing and teaching. And we did the same thing with Peak. And the really cool thing about that is I reached out to Anders Ericsson, the author, and sent him an email thinking, I'm not going to hear back from this cat, but I did. And he seemed really excited about the fact that I was trying to apply his lessons from his book in my teaching style, my practicing style, and even hoping to write a book applying some of those principles aimed at musicians and trumpet players. And we had a Skype meeting. No one was using Zoom as much back then. And then he came in and addressed our entire studio class during one of the weekly studio classes, which was really awesome because they got all the whole kids. They'd all read the book. They got to ask him the questions. He asked us questions. And so I'm trying to be very broad in terms of what I expose myself to and the studio. And that's been one of the, I think maybe the most important evolution in my teaching is that I'm always trying to actively learn. In fact, as a teacher, I tell the kids I just think myself as another student of the instrument. I'm just old. That's the only difference between me and them. So, but I learn from them, and I encourage them, man, if you go out get lessons with other people, just let me know what you learn. And we want to create kind of a culture of learning in the studio, ideally, that we all grow from.
Right, exactly. What kind of things do you do with a student who has difficulty with the upper register, for example?
I tend to focus on flexibility. And one of the things I try to check now that I wouldn't have done when I first started teaching is trying to figure out are the mechanics sound. So for example, back then I didn't even really recognize the issues with a low setup and the issues that can cause some people manage with it, but other people don't. And that's, I think, what's difficult about pedagogy of the technique of our instrument. Some people look perfectly orthodox and have big problems. Other people look really weird and sound and play beautifully. So there's a little bit. The first principle is if it ain't broke, don't fix it, so to speak. But if I see there is an issue there with stamina and high register, and those tend to go hand in hand for most people, I start with seeing is everything mechanically sound. Does the chin, pop up as you go to the high register? Are they set into the red? Are these things that might need to be adjusted? And the next thing to check is how good is their flexibility? How much muscle are they using to move around the instrument? Basically, that's something I can identify with because that was my big mechanical issue when I was a kid was excess muscle. And it's a very common thing with trumpet players, of course. I think when we pick up the instrument, our instinct is to do this to play, and it doesn't work, sadly. So we have to find better means. And so usually I'll approach it primarily by flexibility unless there is another mechanical issue that might need to be addressed.
Right. So what kind of things within flexibility have you noticed that seem to fix things? Are you much of a mouthpiece buzzer, or is it visualization?
It's a lot of these some of these same exercises that Denny showed me, these da 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 dee 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 dee, these kinds of very simple exercises, also expanding to wider intervals.
Mm-hmm.
So you start with a ba dee da dee da ee da ee da ee dee. So I'll do these like starting on G and do them maybe from G to high C,
Yeah.
you know, and try to hit every parcel in between and gradually approach it. And then when that feels good, go to low C. So you're doing 2 octave slurs.
Yeah.
It can be a danger if someone's new to this. They shouldn't go right for the 12th or the 2 octaves, right? You start where it's comfortable. It might just be the G to E. And you overtrain for that G to E by working on the octave slur.
Right.
You overtrain for the octave slur by going to the false B flat above, you know.
Yeah.
Also, another kind of flexibility that we don't always think of as flexibility, I think, has to do with bending tones and getting your centering really together and using the kind of flexibility we develop with bending tones to ascertain that you're always playing in the center. Because to me, those are the 2 keys to stamina and to a good high register. Resonating in the center of the sound, so you're not fighting the horn. Because most of us want to play a bit sharp, and that tends to amount to a bit of a wrestling match, affects stamina, projection, the beauty of our sound, etc. And good flexibility. And I've never known anyone who had a really good centered sound and really good flexibility and struggled in the high register. I haven't encountered anyone who has all 3 of those attributes. So there seems to be some lessons there for us, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, do you have a routine that you do, or do you have one that your students do? Is it fairly uniform, or is it what kind of things do you do in a warm up for students, for example, first, I would say?
A lot of what I start off with, I do some mouthpiece buzzing initially, and a lot of it's stamp based stuff. And my first goal with the mouthpiece buzzing is to make sure that I'm really getting my ear engaged with what I'm doing. I find that a lot of students feel like there are people who have perfect pitch and there's the rest of us who can't hear anything, you know. And I'm like, no, most of us become professional musicians are in the middle, you know. We learn to have really good relative pitch, and we tend to internalize a lot of pitch. So I feel like what I've developed over the years is quasi perfect pitch and slow-mo. For example, you know, I wasn't like most people who develop perfect pitch. It doesn't appear to be a natural thing. It appears to be a particular kind of training at a certain age. And I didn't have it, so I didn't develop it in the sense that, you know, a lot of people really do. But it's almost never that I'm holding the horn and I'm about to play a note and I can't hear the note. Right. You know, some of that almost becomes effectively a type of muscle memory. The association when you're holding the horn with the audiation, the mental image of the sound. And I definitely encourage people to develop that. And mouthpiece buzzing can really help with that because the trumpet makes no corrections for you. So we're doing some James Stamp stuff. I also feel it helps me out with my breathing, because if I'm down in this range, down there, by the end of this exercise, you know, I'm completely out of air, and I'm not even using a real embouchure at the time. I'm kind of letting the lips come out by the end, but it's still moving air and controlling pitch. And that kind of gets me into the groove. And after that, for me, and I encourage a lot of kids to do this, whether they're jazz players or not, I do some improvisation. And that's partially about getting that sort of the right areas of the brain engaged with creative problem solving and the fun element of what we do. Mm-hmm. Because after that, I get down into the nitty gritty doing James Stamp, doing bending stuff. And I integrate a little bit of flexibility into the James Stamp bending exercises. Just doing stuff like, for example, if I'm doing this, and maybe do the octave, or, you know, so I'll keep going up the parcels and keep going down to low C, and etc. You know, up to high C. And right now, that's the only real flexibility work that I'm doing, because I feel it doesn't seem to really leave my chops.
Right.
And that's just a particular period in my playing. You know, obviously, one time I was a kid, it was the crucial thing I practiced, and it may become that way again at some point. But I spend more time myself working on I keeping articulation really working and fingers really agile, and so for the kids, what we try to do is shape whatever routine they need. All of them at this stage as undergrad trumpet players are dealing with some degree of flexibility, and I just want them thinking about the divided skill set. You know, the articulation with its subdivisions of, you know, single tongue, K tongue, double tongue, triple tongue, jazz articulation, flexibility, of course, finger dexterity, low range, high range, centering, all these kinds of different skills that I'd like them to work on.
Yeah, yeah. And so, and that kind of turns me to another thing. Talk about, I want to talk about some of the new music you work on so much and how you
Okay.
learn those pieces. Because you brought up before, like the Stevenson, Plug, Vizzuti. I love that CD, by the way.
Oh,
That's,
thanks,
you
man.
know, yeah. And I love how Tony writes too, like a couple pieces he's written based on paintings. Like he did sort of the one for trumpet and organ that's, you know what I'm talking about. Leave my brain
Yeah.
now. But talk about maybe how that came about, that album, and what your contribution as a player was to influence them to write a certain way.
Yeah, that's a great couple of questions. So with the album, it's funny. It's in some ways maybe the most ambitious album I've done because all the music was new and it was also recorded. The recording situation was different for every piece. So the Plogue, for example, we did live in a high school auditorium in Florida with the brass band in Central Florida. And then with the Salt River Brass for the Vizzuti, Pat Sheridan had created the arrangement for brass band of Vizzuti's concerto. They recorded it on their own in the concert hall because we basically had like a couple hours to throw it down. After we had just played a concert, I was like, I'm not even going to try to, yeah, it's because I played full concerts and solos, multiple pieces. I was like, lay it down, I'll come back and pick it up late. I'll come back or we'll do it somewhere. So they did it in the hall, and I ended up recording it in a studio, my part, in Richmond, and working with in the master to try to make the sound match the room. It was quite a process. It says that we were going to do more of that because then with the Stevenson, we did that in a studio in Tokyo with the Tokyo Symphonic Ones with Jim conducting, but that was just them. Because again, we had a really short amount of time, and it was like between my screw ups and their screw ups, we're not going to get this unless we do it this way. We got them to do it. They did great. We edited it, and then I recorded my part in the studio. And again, so now we had to make both groups' elements sound like they're in some kind of a beautiful hall. You know.
Yeah.
The weirdest one though was the Andy Scott piece because for that one, we thought we had time to do all, and we ran out of time. They had a really ambitious project. In a weekend, they were recording an entire CD of concertos. With Stephen Mead was there and Les Neese, two of these, you know, very prominent British brass band guys. And so we got the first part of the piece live in the room, and I was like, you know, there's this crazy percussion thing that was in the middle. That's really, you know, we had to kind of work. I was like, why don't you guys lay that down, and you know, and then after that, you know, we'll get the ending part with the band, blah 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 blah, and then we just ran out of time, cats. So as we realized this, so we're like, let's just get the band, let's just get takes of the band doing these sections, get the rhythm, the percussion doing the middle, and I had to do the last third of the piece in the studio in Richmond and try to make it sound like what we did in the hall.
That's some great engineering because if you didn't read those notes, you wouldn't know that's in different places.
Yeah, I think there are all the engineers did wonderful work. The guys who were on site with each of the bands, Carlos Chafin, who was the guy who was working with in Richmond, who's just a master engineer, and Neil Brown is a guy who works who did the mastering, who did the kind of final editing to make everything sound like it belonged on the same CD and would hang together. And hats off to that guy. He had the hardest task of all, maybe. After everyone did their own thing, and then he had to make it sound like it actually made sense together.
You would never know listening to that was indifferent. I mean, I when I looked at the liner notes, I thought, "Are you serious? That's how many different bands and what?"
That's awesome, man. I appreciate that, and I remember being really nervous about it, and then one of heroes to all of us, of course, Wayne Bergeron. I don't remember where we were. We were together for something. I gave him a copy of the CD, and very, very kindly, he was like on a plane listening to it, and he made a comment, really nice stuff, but he was like, and the sound quality, it's really good. I was like, oh, I was like, if there's a guy in our circles who spends so much time in the studio, who's gonna hear funkiness, it's Wayne. And the fact that he responded so well, I was like, okay, thank goodness for Neil Brown and the other guys who all did such a great job. But yeah, it was very challenging. There were definitely some tearing the hair out kind of moments trying to make it work.
Just crazy playing and inspiring and depressing at the same time. So I guess I just we've covered a couple of things I'd written down, but I guess two questions. First of all, I'd say what's on your stereo these days? What are you listening to? What are you checking out during this period where we're?
Well, I've been checking out. The other day I was checking out Greg Gisbert. Do you know Greg? Who is?
I met him incidentally riding on of just a flight one time, and I saw his gig bag, and I knew who he was, but I didn't know his face, and I said, "Oh, I sure know who you are."
And he's such a nice guy, right? He was very,
nice.
Sure, he's very humble and just a stunning player. I think one of the most underrated players ever, really. I mean, a guy who is just absolutely commanding lead player and such a fluid jazz player and so inventive. So I was listening to one of his albums with Chris Potter, who's probably my favorite all-around musician right now, and I was checking that out recently. I was also checking out some maybe more surprising stuff. Do you know this singer-songwriter Elliott Smith, who's a pop artist who passed away, I think, back in '99? Just really hauntingly beautiful songs. And I'm working on a duo project right now with a great piano player friend of mine named Daniel Clark, who he tours with Katie Lang when they're touring, and has played with a number of groups, big pop groups, and is also just an exquisite jazz player. And so we're working on some of this kind of repertoire. We're checking out songs that might fit this a little more kind of a gentle style, and some of these really beautiful pop songs that can fit into this more jazz language setting. And we were checking out the Beach Boys, God Only Knows. And every time I've heard that song, I'm like, this song is so gorgeous. I want to play it. So working on an arrangement of that. And so I've been going back and forth between, checking out a variety of jazz artists and rediscovering some Beatles songs too we were thinking of doing, rediscovering some other pop artists.
Yeah.
And there's always just a huge mass of music out there to check out. It's amazing and wonderful and intimidating at the same time,
I'm sure you know Mike Zonshine a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I know Mike's name.
Well, he's a trumpet player in LA, but he'll be so happy to hear that you're looking at some Beach Boy stuff. He's a giant Brian Wilson head. So.
Oh, great! I've definitely heard his name. Yeah. Well, good. We have that in common. I think he's it's another one of those, musicians. It's another one of those bands that has a certain pop reputation, but a lot of musicians who listen more deeply are like, whoa, there's some heavy stuff happening here. It's B-side. Even like right now, Lady Gaga, man. I mean, she has this, this pop icon status, but you listen to some of her early albums and some of the B-side stuff, and it's like, whoa.
Yeah.
Beautiful, deep stuff.
A lot more to her than bacon dresses or whatever it was she was wearing at the...
Oh, yeah.
No, she's a great musician.
Yeah, no, and I'm not. Believe me, I'm. I don't even eat meat or dairy, so I wasn't a big fan of that stuff either. Believe me.
Right.
But But there's like, and I think she was trying to make some kind of a statement maybe about that. But
Yeah,
that's the thing too, is like lots of times there are musicians they have sort of this mythology that surrounds them, and some of them maybe doesn't go beyond that very much, but some of them really do, and I think it's really interesting for us as musicians who are steeped in classical and jazz music to find those treasures and say, "Wow, this is something really hip." I think Lady Gaga changed a lot of minds when she sang with Tony Bennett,
yeah,
and everyone was like, "Whoa, she can totally hang," and that opened a lot of eyes to musicians, and a lot of people I think started thinking of her stuff a little differently. You know.
absolutely, man. And actually, and you just brought up another. We were talking before we came on about this. You know, you normally you travel so much. I mean, and so could you talk a little bit about the the physical aspect of instrument carriage, eating, staying hydrated, sleeping, hotel rooms, pillows. I mean, do you take your own pillow?
No, I don't, but that's been a problem sometimes because I have had some problems with my neck and shoulders, and it's interesting right now. In contrast to all that, my last travel was, it's coming. I think we were talking about before that my last actual concert was in Lima, Peru, in March, and then a few days after that, I was in Indianapolis. I was supposed to play as a guest soloist with the Jazz Band of America at the Music for All festival, and they sent us home early, and that's been it for real travel. And so one of the silver linings of all that is I've been in the gym almost every day since they opened again, and I'm keeping a routine. I've lost weight. I'm getting regular therapeutic massages, to deal with some of these neck issues and all that. But yeah, I feel very different than I did in the midst of all that travel, and I didn't realize how much pain I was in,
Yeah,
and how much discomfort. And it's I'm a huge fan of wines. I'm kind of a student of wines, and so at home it's very easy to control. I basically have one glass a
yeah,
night, just a nice glass, and sometimes on the plane you're in business class and they keep filling up, and it's like you don't even think about it. Then next you wake up when you arrive, you're like, oh my God, why did that happen? I ate too late and I shouldn't have had the meal. There's all kinds of bad habits can creep in, including sleeping on pillows that mess up your neck. You know what I mean? I'm much better when I was in my 20s. You
yeah,
would be out late too. You'd be crazy, hanging with the guys. So much more disciplined now about that. But still, it doesn't matter. Even if you try to control your eating and you only have a drink or two, it's still punishing on the body. So I've tried to, when I do start traveling again, assuming we get to back to some kind of normalcy, I really want to maintain this kind of level of physical care. My diet, it's like I haven't eaten dairy or meat in the last 10 years, but it's still easy to eat unhealthy even if you adhere to that. Oreos are vegan, for example. Who knew that? That just seems wrong, right? But it's like in most French fries, for example, so all kinds of bad things you can put in your body, even if you're taking those kind of steps with your diet. So I'm being smart about that. When it comes to travel, so when I was traveling, the things that worked is, what I tended to do was rely on my home practice to set me up for the travel. So I practiced very heavily at home, and I was playing lessons and setting things up and managing my chops for whatever was coming up. And then I was pretty laid back about whatever was happening on the road. Not that I wouldn't practice, but I wouldn't worry about it if I couldn't.
right.
So lots of times you have a schedule where the first thing is a clinic. You get a quick warm up. You do what you got to do. There might be a rehearsal, and there's a concert, and I got to be happy just getting that and hope to come out and have my A game. Other times it'd be amazing. Like I'm playing with an orchestra, and they're like, hey, you know what? You can get into the hall all afternoon before the rehearsal. I got 4 hours to myself in the hall, so I'd have the 3,000 seat practice room, and get to shed, and it
Yeah,
sounds great because it's a big room and all this, but that's pretty rare. Other times it's like, hey, we got a closet for you, or you're in the hotel, and I'd sneak and open a horn when I felt I could and use a practice meet when I couldn't, and so. But that's why I would rely on really disciplined practice at home to set myself up for tours. And thankfully, because most of my trips are fairly short, it's very rare that I'd be gone for more than 2 weeks at a time. It was okay. Once 2 weeks go by, if it has been regular practice, I start to feel a little bit off, and I feel like I got to get in and do with my fundamentals and kind of establish a routine again. But thankfully, that's fairly rare for me. We talked about travel. I think we mentioned this before. I've used the raw brass quad case. Typically, I put it under the plane, and if it's a short trip, I don't worry about it because I'm going to fly United, and because I have a bit of status with them. They take a priority. It's very, very rare they would lose it. Nothing could ever be damaged in those cases because they're amazing unless someone opened it and threw horns around, which thankfully never happened.
Yeah.
If I have a longer trip, a longer haul with long layover, or I need to keep the chops in shape, I would typically take my B flat in a very soft case with a practice mute. I'd practice in airports. I'd practice on the plane. If I was lucky and got my business class upgrade, I can actually practice in my seat. And with the schmute in, no one can hear me, or the Yamaha silent brass, either one of those mutes, no one can hear me. If I wasn't in business class, I could go to the restroom when I was asleep. No one could hear me. And I don't want to do that if anyone's trying to get in, of course. That would be rude. But
were you sitting or standing in there?
What's that? I would always stand.
Oh, man.
I would always stand fully clothed, Mark. I'm sure.
Yeah. Good. Oh gosh. But you do travel across time zones quite a bit when you travel.
Yeah.
So now talk about that a little bit. How do you manage? Do you plan that out? Like, I'm going to sleep here. I'm going to take some kind of melatonin here or something like that, or you just do it?
I haven't really, and it's been a mixed blessing because I find that for the most part, my work doesn't suffer too much. In other words, I feel like I still have good energy teaching, and I play the same, but I feel crummy. You know what I mean? So what my mode has been basically, I don't really try to adjust. It's like I got to wake up and I got to go do the gig, and then I have 2 hours off, and I'm exhausted. I'm in a hotel. I will sleep, and I will get up half an hour before I have to be the next thing, whatever. And so it depends. Like the last real hardcore time zone trip, but Australia is always the hardest one, or New Zealand, But I've only been to New Zealand 3 times, I think. I've been about 10 times to Australia. So that's always a real hardcore time change. And last time was just about a year ago. Exactly. Actually, now that I think about it, I think I got it back from that trip. And so it was the same kind of thing where I would just let myself adjust. And after 10 days or something over there, I felt, all right, I'm really in the groove. And then I had to come back and start over. And that was painful because I remember I flew in, I got in on a Tuesday night, and the next day I taught it must have been 8 hours of lessons. And then I went straight to the airport again to fly to Atlanta to do the Georgia State concert with the jazz band.
Right.
And oh my, that really hurt. That was.
You didn't seem that tired here, though. You seemed like you're totally fine.
Well, I can fake it, and then I go back to the hotel room and collapse. And that's kind of been my mode. I'm not sure that's the best approach. I think I'm going to be 52 in February, and I'm lucky that I've been healthy and probably now more than in recent years because I haven't been traveling for the last few months. But I might want to think a little more strategically about maybe dealing with some melatonin or something to make sure I'm regulating my sleep. And maybe travel with a pillow too. That's probably not a bad idea, to deal with this neck issue.
That kind of sucks when that goes out. But well, Rex, and don't sign off. I'm just gonna say thanks for doing this. Everybody who's checking this out, you should definitely check out Rex's YouTube channel, Rex Richardson Trumpet, right?
Yeah, just Rex Trumpet, I think.
Rex Trumpet, because there's all of your 100 days of practice stuff is on there, and there's all kind of great tips.
Unfortunately, there are only 45 so far.
Well,
but There's a pause in that, but there's kind of a reason for that too, because I'm hoping to make an announcement very soon. I was hoping to be able to do it on this, but I don't have the contract in hand yet. But we're supposed to be doing a thing with a book deal for our 100 days of practice with Rex Richardson, which I'm hoping will also feature a lot of advice from a lot of my trumpet heroes, and I'm hoping to interview a little bit on what they do. And there will also be a whole set of videos for that. Eventually, I think 100 videos to line up with the 100 days of practice in this book. So it'll be a nice size project. Hopefully, people will find that helpful. But yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you there. I just wanted to point out why there weren't quite 100 days of videos in there yet.
No, that's great. And if you go to your website, you can order CDs, T-shirts.
Oh yeah, we have T-shirts up there.
You do have T-shirts up there.
Oh, my wife must have done that.
Yeah, I think she did that. Yeah.
Okay.
But
Cool.
anyway, Rex, thanks so much for doing this. And hang on just a second. And thanks for everybody who checked it out. And we will see you very soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. Appreciate it, man.
Thanks, Rex.